Very excited to be here. This is my first Wisdom 2.0, and I'm going to share with you a little different impression from maybe some of the talks that you've already seen. And I'm going to just whiz right through this just to give you a quick tour of what we're doing in our lab here at UCSF, and then that'll give us some time for Jack and I to talk. I just want to start by telling you what I look at as the big goal that we're focusing on in our lab, and that's improving the quality of life. And a lot of other folks in my profession, neuroscientists, neurologists, are not necessarily focused right on this. They're thinking about longevity. How do we live longer? And I think it's critical for us not to just focus on that, but how do we live better? So how do we do that? Lots of different ways. One of the ones that I focus on is this one. How do we improve cognition in both those that are healthy and those that are impaired? Thinking of cognition very broadly here, including perception, memory, attention, decision-making. So how do we go about this process? And the win is to improve our interactions with ourselves and each other, and also to raise and elevate the human mind, right? That's the biggest win that we would hope for. So in my lab, we focus on these abilities. These are the core foundational abilities of our brain that underlie higher order cognition. They are what allows us to interact with our environment in a goal-directed way. And we look at this as a trilogy of skills. So they are attention, both our ability to focus our attention and our resources externally, as well as with inside, and to sustain them. A real foundational element of mindfulness practice in itself. Working memory, a very related skill, which is holding that information in mind and then using it to guide your behavior. And what we call goal management. When you're task switching or multitasking, we've already heard about a lot of that today. So in my lab, we use a set of tools, functional MRI, EEG, transcranial stimulation, to understand how neural networks of the brain underlie these abilities. Now, we're very interested, starting in 2008, in how we can develop the type of approach to now improve these skills. And to do that, we think of this as the fuel to that engine, brain plasticity, the ability of our brain to modify itself, to reshape itself in response to new experiences from the environment. How do we harness brain plasticity to improve our cognitive abilities? We have two main design principles that we adhere to when we develop new technology. They are adaptivity and feedback. And I'm going to tell you a lot more about this. But how do we bring these skills in and allow someone to expand due to them? For that, we use video game technology and as a training tool. So let me just dive in with a quick figure to show you what I mean by that. The real essence of this is something that we call the closed loop. All engineers know that the most powerful way to change a system is through a closed-loop feedback approach. So this is how it works. Something happens in your brain that causes you to interact in a very specific way with your environment. In this case, a video game. That video game, in our hands, is detecting your performance in real time, using that data to then feed back to you either rewards, which is what we call feedback, or to modify its very basic elements, something we call adaptivity, and then a new environment is presented to you. And through this closed loop circuit, where you intervene in some way, it detects you and feeds back, you get a very powerful system of change. And that's what we try to do, to develop based on this principle. So in 2008, I reached out to friends of mine in the video game industry. There's actually LucasArts, and I asked them to help build a game that was created on a closed-loop principle of adaptivity and feedback to train the cognitive control abilities of older adults who we know are deficient in these abilities. So this is a game called NeuroRacer. I'm not going to go into detail here. We don't have a lot of time, but essentially you have these two tasks going on, maintaining your car on the road and responding as rapidly and accurately to target signs like the green circles, not green squares or green pentagons. While that's going on, you have both of these tasks adapting and pushing your ability to the limit. I'm just going to give you a quick snapshot of some of the data that we collected for 4 years using this paradigm. The first, we could use it as a performance indicator, a very sensitive tool to look at behavioral change. What you're looking at here is a curve of how multitasking on this game changes from age 20 to age 80. You could see this is not like a plateau and then declines in one horrible year, right, when you're 69 years old. This is a linear decline throughout life. And we have the neural data on top of it there. And I won't go into the details here, but I'll show you that when we bring a group of older adults in, these are healthy 60 to 80-year-olds, have them play this game in this adaptive high feedback environment for a month, what we see is this occurs. We can improve their ability to multitask on the game to a very high level, change their neural signatures that underlie it, improve other abilities that weren't trained on the game, like their attention and working memory, and even sustain some of these skills 6 months later. We were really fortunate that after all this effort, this was published at the end of 2013 and really inspired us to take this to the next step. And that's what I just want to quickly give you a little bit of insight on. So we have a series of new games. One of them we call MetaTrain, and this is the topic of, or at least the introduction that Jack and I had to each other. This is a very interesting collaboration, not just Jack and I that come about this from two different worlds and are learning to work together to accomplish this goal, but also that we have development team that helps us at Zynga as a philanthropic effort, the big game company. So in many ways, this is a very unique collaboration between different individuals with, and companies from multiple perspectives, all converging on this goal to use modern technology as a way to elevate how our brains work. I don't have time to go into the details of it. It's an iPad game. You could see some screenshots of it here. But the basic idea is that after being instructed by Jack what it means to focus internally on your breath and hold your attention there, you get to do that over a very short period of time, monitoring when your breath, when your attention to your breath fluctuates, bringing it back again, and then responding whether you were successful at singular attention or not. Based on that information, that then gives you a little more time if you are successful, or a little less time. And over time, you see that you can increase your ability to hold focus. We find that most people in our pilot testing are only able to do this for 20 seconds on their first day without being self-interrupted, but most people increase to over a minute or even 2 minutes over several weeks. So the question is now, what happens to them? What changes in their brain? What changes in their cognition? What changes in their mood? Does their stress change? Does their sleep change? That's what we're about ready to do now. After years of development on this, we're about ready to begin a study where we record everything on individuals that go through this type of training in a placebo-controlled study to start understanding what are the design principles and mechanics that we could bake into a technology to lead to an improvement in this type of internal self-regulation of attention. We have many other games going on. I can't really give you a deep dive into the internal distraction. That's MetaTrain. We have a game focused on rhythm. That's in a collaboration with Mickey Hart, the percussionist from the Grateful Dead. We have a distributed attention game, which is maybe more similar to open meditation or expansive meditation. That takes place in virtual reality in an Oculus Rift. And we have a body-brain, a mind-brain game that uses the Kinect, which is an Xbox tool for motion capture. So what you see is a pretty high level of technology, but all really targeting improving these core principles about how our brain operates. What we hope is that we will see how all of these interact together. So I think over the next year, when we start studying all of these with that really high level of validation, that will not be the ultimate win. The win will take place in the future when we think of what I call neuro-CrossFit, how all of these come together to lead to a synergistic effect on how our brain operates, and really understanding the principles that we can apply and validate very carefully to improve how our brains function. So let me tell you about one last thing in our lab. This is known as the glass brain. We look at the video game technology as just the beginning, a way of activating neural circuits in a specific way. What you're looking at here is a combination of an MRI and an EEG image. This is a high-density 64-channel mobile EEG that's collecting data, different rhythms of the brain in real time, and projecting it onto the surface of the brain. So this was work that we did with a group in UCSD and the Schwartz Center and also NVIDIA to get this real-time processing. So what's going on in real time is we're rejecting the artifacts, we're finding the sources, we're looking at how brain areas are communicating through a process of synchronization. We're displaying it all in 3D and then bringing it into a Unity game engine where we develop our games. And you have this beautiful, really unique ability to fly through a functioning brain in real time. So if you were in our lab and you had a scan done and then you had a cap on and you were playing one of our games and you were looking, and we could also do this in virtual reality, you would basically see inside your functioning brain. Now what does that mean? What can we do with that? Well, one thing is to just elevate the research that I already showed you. Can we feed not just performance data into our games, but actually how your brain is functioning in real time? Can this be, in its essence, a mindfulness, a meditative tool to teach you how to control these rhythms? So that's a new project, but I just wanted to throw that out there as another form of bringing in very high technology that's not even fully developed and thinking about it as a way of improving how our brains function. So I want to thank you. That's just an opening. This is going to be the real meat of it, but I felt like giving a little context to what we're going to talk about would help. So now, why don't we dive in a bit?
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. And I just want to say one of the reasons that we're collaborating together, just take a step back, because what you're hearing on the stage today, here you hear Pico Iyer talking about no connectivity whatsoever, and silence and solitude and so forth. But what's also true, you're hearing this mandala of pieces, is that we do live in a connected world, and an enormous number of millions of hours are being spent gaming, especially by the generation that's now growing up in this tech age. And so it's also where people are and what's being developed. The pleasure of working with you, Adam, is that much of the research so far, what Richie Davidson presented and others, the 4,000 papers and studies on mindfulness and so forth, has been understanding the mechanisms, validating the capacities to train the brain in different ways, and looking at the potential that's possible. And I see the work that you're doing, Adam, as a next step in allowing us to use the technologies to train ourselves in ways that hadn't happened before. And to give one simple example, if I teach a retreat or a class in mindfulness of breath, which is what you got your NIH grant for that started the MetaTrain, I might say, train, and here's how you do the breathing practice, and people will sit for 20 minutes or half an hour, and I'll say, how did it go? And they'll say, well, I was making my grocery list, and I was redoing that argument with my spouse or whatever. But with the feedback loop, after you do 6 breaths, did your attention wander? Well, then let's try 4. It didn't wander, well, let's try 8 then. And within a very short time, this kind of immediate real-time feedback, it feels like it's the next step in integrating technology into the contemplative arts. And we know all this stuff is going to happen anyway, so I'm glad that he's working for the good, basically, and using this, using the technology in a way that begins to open the contemplative capacities and marry them to technology.
Well, I mean, just from a personal perspective, I can't even convey how encouraging it was to hear Jack say that, especially when the first time I met him, because I have to say I was pretty intimidated and terrified to tell him that we were taking this beautiful multi-thousand-year-old tradition and putting it inside an algorithm in an iPad. And so I remember that day quite well. We were borrowing from skills and methodology that we had developed for a long time, and this aspect of a closed-loop feedback system is a very powerful one. We know it's a way to invoke change. No one denies that. But could it cross over to this world? I mean, it was an open-ended question. I come from another side. I don't have a meditation practice, although it seems to be in my future. And so to share this idea with someone with Jack's experience and perspective was intimidating. And when he thought it was a good one and wanted to help us work on it and really to help convey what the focus is in the game, took everything to the next level. Now I know, in retrospect, we could not have done it to the same degree without him, but it was the combination that really, I think, is unique.
So I have a few questions to ask, given the time we have. The traditional teachings of these kind of contemplative trainings, whether it's attention, concentration, and so forth, they're wedded to a base of ethics and compassion, and non-harming. And so that's, yes, it's hard to meditate after a day of killing and stealing. Doesn't work terribly well. So you have to pay attention to how you're living. That's also informing your nervous system. How do you see the connection? How does this fit together with the kind of trainings that you're developing?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the aspects of our approach, it's undeniable, is a bit of reductionism, right? We try to look at what is an active ingredient in something, whether it be music training. Well, there's the act of becoming more rhythmic. In the act, meditation, it is this internal singular focus on your breath, the concentrative aspect of it. And so we pull out an ingredient, put it through our algorithm, which allows it to be reproducible and deliverable, and also very controllable in a study. So we get that tremendous advantage from a research perspective, but it is a bit, it's obviously in isolation from the many other aspects that occur, for example, in a meditation retreat. Now, to us, that's an asset because we have less variables and we're able to make much stronger conclusions when you have such a controlled environment. The problem is, or the hurdle, it's not a problem, it's just a stepwise process, is that there are incredibly important components that are also going on at the same time that are probably involved in at least some of the outcomes that occur when you engage in contemplative practices, especially at a retreat with other people. So it's very important, like, when you have a small time frame like that was like TED-style time, like bam, that's it. You don't really get a deeper message. And one of the things that I didn't say that I should is that, we don't view this as a holy grail or, a magic bullet. This is a step, a piece of starting to understand what the different elements do to the brain and to other aspects of our physiology, and then start putting them together, seeing how they interact and grow. So I see this as step one. We already know that we're already in discussion on what 2.0 looks like in our world, and where it goes and how we get to bring in these other critical aspects of interactivity and then what happens when they come together.
So, and you're somebody who builds bridges. So not only are you doing this stuff in your lab, but you were teaching in San Quentin, you said, and speaking about neuroscience to the lifers in San Quentin, you said if you talk about the brain, that's a kind of neutral language. Everyone has one and they're interested in how it's operating. So you're able to, in some way, use this language to break down the silos and connect different.
Yeah, it's one of those things that, happen in your life and you don't really know how you wound up there. But, a big part of what I do now is travel and talk to audiences that are very different. Like this audience is a very different one for me, but, San Quentin was as well. And similar, no. And, and then the other eye-opener is the global aspect of all this. There's really no language when it comes to how the brain works, right? Language sits on top of those processes, but this is a real, fully, complete global conversation across all ages and cultures, and that's what makes it so exciting. One other thing related to that, when I started here, I'm a neurologist and trained in the healthcare. I work at UCSF, we're a medical center. I always thought about what I was doing as a medical tool, as a way of helping people when they had a deficiency in their brain in some way that put them under, behind the eight ball. They weren't really normal. They were below what average was for whatever population they were in. Now, because of largely giving talks to different audiences, my eyes have opened and started thinking about these approaches for people that are healthy, that are just trying to elevate themselves in some way. And that's been a big eye-opener for me. And I think a lot of the focus on MetaTrain now is for healthy populations. We're very interested in what it's like for children. How low can we go in age? How young can we get and have a degree of introspection that allows a child to do this? How old, different populations. So that's the exciting frontier that we have to look forward to.
And I was telling you, I was at an education conference with teachers who were using mindfulness in the classrooms, and there was a kindergarten teacher who was trying to get children to learn to see what was going on in their own minds and their thoughts, get them in a circle, and talk about thinking as popcorn. And when you notice a thought, you raise your hand like a peat kernel has just popped. And so they're all sitting there smiling with each thought and raising their hand as their popcorn thoughts go. So it turns out that you can begin actually in a very, very young age to begin to teach social and emotional learning. But here's the question then that it goes to, and you and I have talked about this. Once the training of mindfulness of breathing or one of the other concentration tools is developed in this skillful way, then how do we use it to develop wisdom or develop compassion? And it seems to me that traditionally in contemplative basis, once you have concentration, then you can use it. It's like polishing the lens or steadying the lens. Then you can use it to look around and see what's actually going on. You can look at emotions and how they function. I'm hoping that one of the next steps that we do actually is to have people like the popcorn thing begin, after they can be aware of their breath, to notice the thoughts. Are they past thoughts or future thoughts or present thoughts? What's the flavor of the thought? And all of a sudden, you're invited to be in a contemplative space supported by this kind of interaction. Is this going to work?
Yeah, I mean, we don't really know, right? But
You've got the lab. We're going to check
that's
it
what
out.
science is. We have to figure it out. But I'm excited about it. If we didn't meet, that probably wouldn't have been a conversation that we would have been having in our lab. Part of running a lab and having a group that's trying to maintain some sense of focus, and we work on those cognitive control abilities that I described. And that's already pretty broad. A lot of labs only focus on attention. We focus on working memory and goal management and even long-term memory. And so the conversations of compassion and wisdom are not really things that come up at lab meeting normally for us. But now, after we met and hearing, which was also something I didn't appreciate, that the first step of more in-depth contemplative practices is this learning of focus and control. So we're already unwittingly doing the first step, which was great and made it easier. And then understanding that once we have this population of participants in our study, we have a very unique population, right? They're going to have started naive, no meditators in this group. They're going to have spent 6 weeks with us, gradually 5 days a week, learning how to have more and more focus without wandering. And we've already done this in a pilot study, and we know that people get really good at this. And so now we have a population that's going to be uniquely suited to see where do we go from there. And the idea that we can improve things like compassion and wisdom, which would have seemed inaccessible to me if we didn't have a building block, a starting point, wouldn't have made sense. But I'm excited to go there.
And then we started our conversation. I said, well, all right, let's use this for wisdom. And the question is, well, how do you train wisdom? But it turns out that there are some, in Buddhist psychology, as an example, there are some specific practices and techniques once you have a steadiness of attention that you can then begin to use this mindfulness to observe the ways that you identify with your thoughts or emotions and start to see the inner workings of your own psyche. And I trust this in some way. Just because I trust mindfulness itself. And people say, well, if you marry it to technology or you use it in these other ways, isn't it going to get diluted or isn't it going to be somehow misused? I'm an advisory board for a group that's training the Marines in some of these practices. And people complain, oh, it isn't going to make a better sniper. It's a fair question. But if you knew or met these 18-year-old kids who come from Columbus, Ohio, or from, Nevada City or wherever, who have never been out of the country, are going to be holding heavy weapons in a country where they don't even know who the enemy is because they sort of look alike to them and they might be wearing a suicide vest or something, and you don't want to teach them steadiness and emotional regulation for their benefit and the benefit of the people that therefore they might not shoot or get in conflict with. So I really trust that as we develop these, this is unknown, this is really new territory, but we are living in this wired age, and so how can we use these? And my last question, or one of the last for you, is how can you envision, beside starting to learn how the mind works with wisdom and finding some greater balance, maybe greater emotional resilience, how do we use these to teach empathy and compassion? What would be the design of games or programs that would teach?
Well, I mean, I don't know the answer to that yet, but the journey that we go on once we have a challenge like that, from our point of view, is that we figure out how to use those design elements, that adaptivity and those feedback loops, because we've seen how quickly they can change the brain. Obviously, we also need to change behavior, and cognition and behavior are not the same thing. You could change the underlying fundamental structure of how the brain operates, but it doesn't mean it translates to how people act in the real world. And that connection between cognition and behavior is almost completely unexplored. It's very complicated, but that's where we want to go. We feel like once we build these underlying strengths in these systems, we now have a group of people that can go to that next step. So, I mean, I think, what we would do is spend a long time with our lab and with you and other advisors that have different perspectives, maybe some people in here, and say, what are the aspects, what are the fundamental important components here that we want to potentiate, and then how do we create the structure that they can be put into this closed loop system. So it's usually a year at least of designing and pulling those out and then putting them in a type of interactivity that's fun, immersive, engaging. We know that this technology is not going to go away, and as much as the message is well taken that it's important to disconnect, which is something I completely agree with, another powerful message to me is to piggyback on all that crazy innovative energy and creation that's happening and starting to validate and repurpose some of these tools, not just for entertainment and communication, but for improving how we function. So I think it's a tough challenge, but if we work together, we have a better chance of getting there, I would say.
So, last couple of minutes, what motivates you? What brought you to do this work?
I sort of don't know how that happened. It's one of those things you travel through your life and you think you have a plan. I mean, I knew I wanted to be a scientist since I was 7 years old, and I got there. I'm a scientist, and you plan the next stage. I'm going to go to med school. I'm going to get a PhD. I'm going to go to residency. I'm going to get a faculty job. But the details are invisible, right? I had no idea that I was going to be on this weird convergence of technology and now the mind. For me, it's largely paying attention to what people really want and they care about. A lot of my colleagues who are brilliant build their research programs based on what they have read and the foundations, the principles that have guided them there, and then they iterate on that. I spend a lot of time talking to people and trying to figure out what their challenges in their lives are, and I heard, well, I have trouble with distraction. I can't focus. I have attention problems. My memory is fading. And so I was inspired by that, and then I looked around. I live here in San Francisco. I'm surrounded by all this innovative activity, and I was like, wow, if we could bring these together, then that's the potential to have an impact. So I largely think it was a combination of listening and also using my environment the best way I could.
Thank you, Adam. It's really a pleasure. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you. Thank you, Jack.
I think this is it's the beginning of something really interesting happening, and it's the next step. And I don't know anybody else doing quite the work you're doing, so stay tuned.
Yes, more to come.
Thank you.
Thank you.